got coffee for so many
I was
months
like,
ago.
oh, I can't talk to you. I have like 6 cups. How long ago?
For like 8 days.
Is there like a break? An intermission?
Voting's intermission. It's not a Bollywood show. It's no intermission.
I was like, is there an intermission?
There's been a Bollywood movie? I got suckered into one.
Alright guys, thanks for hanging tight. We're going to be starting in about like 3 or 4 minutes, okay?
You tell me.
It was like a war where like you're following this warrior, but like all the stills are like action shots of like yeah, like this war right? So I was like, oh, this looks interesting. I can do like this. That's what I thought it was. No, in the first couple moments I'm like, it's like straight up like Logan or like then he comes back to his village, I'm like, whatever. Or he says that. What? So like, and then every other stage was like good. I will say this, I got suckered into it, but you get that combination of like dancing, actual like physical fighting.
Like I
and when you're stranded in the middle of season for 3 months, and you say like, you're only like, no, but like, just every day. Like, I can it's true or what? Actually, because I can hardly fix it. That would be really I want Oh, it's coming.
It's about that.
Oh.
It's about the flavor of it.
Yeah. Presentation, yeah.
Have a really
It looks pretty good. They're actually making it this time.
I really like this.
I've not seen it.
Really, it's really good.
Oh, you're on my snapping? This is what girls do right before an event. Alright.
guys, thanks for coming out tonight. Welcome to this year's Spring Public Policy Forum. We got an exciting night for you guys tonight. We're going to be discussing two key interesting topics. One's going to be about the Paris Agreement, which was passed earlier this year, and the other one's going to be about Citizens United. The money that we get tonight will be working directly towards funding our political science scholarships that we give to our students every year. Let's first off, for those of you who do not know, let's go into the first topic. We're not going to beat around the bush here, we're just going to get straight through this. First off, we're going to be discussing the pros and cons of the Paris Agreement. For those of you who don't know, the Paris Agreement was signed earlier this year, and it was a UN framework that essentially many countries signed, and it's a global, basically, contract for nations to decrease the number of greenhouse gas emissions. They're going to be setting standards for each other and holding each other accountable to that. Now there are going to be two teams, which will be split, with one side illustrating the necessity of such a framework, while the other side will be saying that this is not a good idea. The pros will be discussed by Rachel and Mia on Team A, while the cons will be headed by Joe and Brittany on Team B. I'm going to hand the floor over to the pro side with Rachel and Mia.
So last December, 195 countries came together to create an agreement. And just last Friday, 175 countries came together to sign the Paris Agreement, a monumental document in which every country pledged to take a stand and save the environment. This document was about more than politics. It was about progress. And when this agreement was signed into action, progress won. Paris approached climate change from three ambitious fronts: capping current pollution, including formerly excluded countries in the climate change debate, and promoting strong support from some of the largest fossil fuel users and producers. The importance of this cannot be understated, because goals this strong had never been accomplished before in the history of the United Nations, and more countries than ever recognize the imminent threat of climate change, taking the first step towards a feasible solution. Not only did the Paris Agreement accomplish important aims, establishing the most substantive document battling climate change yet, it also brought world leaders from both the developing and developed world together for the first time, forming a united front to save our future. At the core of this agreement is a limitation on global temperature rise to 2 degrees Celsius. This standard is much lower than the projections of temperature rise before the document was made. So why should you care? Without a worldwide change, the ocean will rise over 5 feet in the near future. This wouldn't just stop us from swimming at the beach. It is projected that over 15,000 people in Orange County alone could lose their homes, their jobs, their lives due to the direct result of ocean flooding. The ultimate truth of this problem is self-evident. Our response must come today. The Paris Agreement is just that response, working towards stopping that 5-foot ocean rise by combating the problem at the international level. The indisputable fact that every country has signed on means that every country recognizes that something needs to be done, and it needs to be done now. One of the failures of the previous document regarding climate change, called the Kyoto Protocol, was its focus on developed countries. Ones like the United States, where we don't have to think about how much it costs to turn on the water or even keep on the lights in this room. This agreement extends well beyond that narrow scope, still addressing these developed countries while also including developing nations such as India, which the previous document failed to include. Continuing with the Kyoto Protocol would allow these developing countries to raise their consumption levels towards those of the US, a dangerous situation that would require 4 whole Earths to sustain. In recognition of this, the Paris Agreement moves away from that dangerous reality and progresses towards a cleaner, safer, and better world. The Paris Agreement notably includes two important signatories that were missing from the Kyoto Protocol, China and the United States. China is the largest producer and largest consumer of fossil fuels worldwide, with the US coming in at a close second, demonstrating the imminent need to have them included in the international discussion on climate change. The absence of China and the US made the suggestions in the Kyoto Protocol seem unimportant, especially to developing countries. However, China and the US were not only included in this discussion, they were some of the largest advocates of the agreement, and their work towards lowering this pollution, along with the model it sets for other countries, makes this document extremely more effective and promotes progress in several industries. A key component of the document is the commitment of every country to stop using fossil fuels in the near future. As mentioned, some of the world's largest producers of fossil fuels are in full support of the Paris Agreement. Even Saudi Arabia, the country that produces the most oil worldwide, has taken the initiative to set an example for the international community by committing to cycle oil out of its economy within the next 20 years. This is progress exemplified, where even the largest countries involved in the oil industry are avidly finding alternative solutions. Others will follow. This overwhelming change cannot and will not occur overnight, and this may not bring Earth to its pre-industrial revolutionary health. However, this document is proof of progress, proof of collaboration, proof that we as a human race have not only recognized the amount of damage we have had on our planet, we are actively working towards reversing it. The Paris Agreement represents victory on two fronts: the ability of the international community to come to a consensus and the precedent-setting environmental standard it created. Yes, more could be done, but the fact that we are changing, we are improving, we are promoting progress is indicative of the fact that we have turned the tide, and we are now marching in the right direction towards this extremely important issue. Thank you.
Next up, we're going to be hearing from the con side. Joe is going to be up first, and then we're going to bounce back to Rachel and then Brittany.
I'd like to thank everyone for coming out today, and I'd also like to thank Mia, because she's absolutely right. In order for the Paris Agreement to be successful, it does require both China and the United States, but we'll get to that in just a moment. Now, despite what our opposition may say, we're not making a case against climate change. That's not up for debate. An overwhelming majority of scientists concur that our climate is changing. In fact, we're making a case that the Paris Agreement is all hype and no action. We will look into the reasons as to why the Paris Agreement will not work at home in America, and we know from history that America set the tone for global agreements. Now, Albert Einstein said that insanity is doing the same thing over again and expecting a different result. Yet here we are. Recalling the infamous Kyoto Protocol, which is unfortunately not a satire, it has been referred to as good intentions but failed legislation. I will demonstrate that the Kyoto Protocol is no different from the Paris Agreement. First, I ask, why was Kyoto unsuccessful? Well, its failure is largely attributed to its lack of political commitment globally and then its soft wording, making it a non-binding agreement. However, let's put off the global aspect for just a moment and focus on the political climate here in the United States that led Kyoto Protocol and its failure to reach the proposed objectives. In order for the U.S. to become a signatory to this agreement, it needs to be ratified by the Senate with a 2/3 majority. In 1997, the Beer-Hagel resolution passed unanimously. It emphasized that the United States would not sign any treaty that would harm the American economy or exempt the developing nations. The credibility of the United States is not enhanced when administrations negotiate a treaty that has no hope of ratification in the Senate. As a result, the Clinton administration never even sent Kyoto to the Senate for a vote. At this time, America was the largest contributor to greenhouse gases in the world. Now, the agreement Clinton endorsed on the global stage was for a reduction in world greenhouse gas emissions by 5%. When it was all said and done, the United States had increased their emissions by 20%, while India increased by 103% and China increased by 150%. Now, parallel this to today. President Obama stated that he committed this country to the tireless task of combating climate change. However, the United States is a system of laws and checks and balances that prevent our president from acting unilaterally. If this was China, the executive could enact any legislation without any debate. But in a democratic society as ours, this agreement is out of our president's hands alone. The U.S. Constitution states that an international agreement providing for the payment of money by the United States requires an appropriation of funds by Congress in order to effect the payment required by the agreement. This means that our president lacks the authority to bind the United States to any agreement without the Senate's support. In 1997, Clinton faced a Republican majority House. Since that today's Senate is held by a majority of 54 Republicans, our president would be hard-pressed to get the 67-vote requirement to enact the Paris Agreement. The fact of the matter is that climate change is a partisan issue here in the United States, and this means in the best circumstances a split House, meaning no two-thirds majority. The Republican Party has their heels dug in, and without their opposition maintaining an overwhelming majority in the Senate, this agreement will not pass. Despite this fact, our president signed the Paris Agreement on Earth Day last Friday without Senate approval. This makes his signature a disingenuous commitment with no actual plan to follow through. How can we expect this agreement to be successful without the United States' involvement, especially after the precedent set by Kyoto? Now, suppose by chance that the Senate does ratify this agreement, what kind of legal ramifications can it have? Well, the Paris Agreement reads, I quote, "For countries to meet their own voluntary targets on limiting emissions between 2020 and 2030. This is just kicking the can further down the road. What this means is that this country will not be held for their lack of commitment, which makes the agreement no different than a New Year's resolution. Echoing the wise words of Al Gore, countries of the developing world shall be exempt. Their first priority is to lift their citizens from poverty and build strong economies. The lack of political commitment has resurfaced as India has volunteered to do less than they have in recent years, and China intends to hold its emissions constant until 2030. Our world's top 3 contributors to greenhouse gas emissions are China, the United States, and India, all of which have politically postured against the agreement through their lack of commitment. Environmental concerns at home change depending on their impact on our daily life. For example, when gas prices are low, public support for drilling offshore is low. But as the gas prices go back up, the support for drilling offshore goes back up. This fluctuation of policy is a result of public support and pressures on the politicians to meet the needs of their constituents. The Heritage Institute estimates that if the Paris Agreement passes, we will lose over 400,000 jobs, household electricity bills will rise by over 20%, and we'll have an aggregated GDP loss of over $2.5 trillion. As these economic problems mount, it is likely that the public opinion will shift against the Paris Agreement. This is one of the main reasons America never committed to Kyoto Protocol. The Byrd-Hagel resolution outlined these economic concerns, and these sentiments have not changed. This economic strain is not localized to just the United States. It has also resulted in other nations missing their target goals, which is another reason that we won't see China or India abiding by it. Now, to summarize, yes, climate change is a global problem, but the Paris Agreement is not the solution. It has been shown that as a result of environmental issues being a partisan issue here in the United States, we'll be unable to financially contribute. Additionally, with a lack of will shown by China and India, who in combination with us emit over 50% of the global greenhouse gases, the Paris Agreement will follow the failed legacy of Kyoto. Instead, we need to take another path of mitigating the consequences of this inevitable crisis. Thank you.
I'd like to invite you guys to think about something rather interesting. We are here today at Irvine Valley College where the sun has been shining all day. But can you imagine in less than 100 years that our community could be underwater due to inland flooding? Reality is that the most recent National Climate Assessment Report projects that within the next century, Southern California will be vulnerable to unparalleled storm surges and weather destruction that will completely destroy Southern California's water supply. But we are better off than most. The San Francisco Bay region will be completely submerged by 2100, with water levels anticipated to rise several feet within the next century, or 100% higher than centuries past. But not just California, the entire world is vulnerable to the effects of climate change, as the Arctic, Antarctic, and Pacific Island ecosystems remain endangered to the threats of melting ice and water level increases. Climate change is our reality. The past 20 years have been the hottest 20 years on record. Here in California, we've been placed under extreme drought watch, as little rainfall in the past 4 years has limited our water supply due to high water evaporation from increasing temperatures. As seen in this chart, our heat in our oceans is so high that the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association has to make a new heat scale just to document it. But climate change is much more than a risk to our oceans. Although we will face some immediate effects in the next 50 years, if we surpass the 3 degrees Celsius mark, 30% of the global species will be up for extinction. And once past 4 degrees Celsius, 40% will be. If we pass 6 degrees Celsius, we are well on the path to Earth's 6th mass extinction. In a study from the University of Connecticut, 1 out of every 6 species is up for extinction due to climate change. Let's take a look at some of the species most at risk. Although they are symbols of Christmas and festive cheer, reindeer are very at risk for extinction due to climate change. They will be extinct by the end of the century. This is the Atlantic puffin. They will be extinct in the next 30 years. And this is the American pika. The pika dies of heat stroke and weather over 80 degrees, and the pika will be extinct in the next 15 years. Is this something that should be inevitable? Should we spend the money necessary to prevent heat-related death, animal extinctions, and the destruction of ecosystems worth it? Absolutely. The Paris Agreement is the first ever international agreement where major political leaders have cooperated and made a complete agreement on carbon emissions. All United Nations countries have signed on to it, and it is an effort to limit this increase. Economically, a transition to weaning off fossil fuels and transition to pricier alternative sources does seem difficult, as mentioned by Joe. However, if anyone knows about economies, you should know that alternative sources haven't been developed on such a large scale, making them a lot more costly. In fact, so many carbon-free emission sources are being developed, from using reflective plate on a building for solar power, to burning algae for energy, to even using oceanic waves for hydroelectric energy. These new markets with economies of scale account for 30% of energy industry growth, but accounts for less than 4% of the total market. By encouraging Paris 2015, countries are inclined to support these industries, which is supporting economic growth. Plus, for those on the money side, think about this. What is more costly? Investing in low-carbon energy emission sources, or trying to cover the losses of cities and water supplies for your businesses? Rebuilding New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina cost $1.25 billion. But about $3 trillion of assets are at risk today, a tally on track to reach $35 trillion by 2070. If a city goes down from increasing water volatility, or if a population loses water, the financial losses are catastrophic. And we have more than New Orleans to worry about. Tokyo, Shanghai, Miami, and even New York City are places most at risk due to climate change. With all that at stake, the lack of a binding emissions goal in Paris 2015 becomes more of a benefit rather than a capability for failure. Governments want to prevent disaster, and with the increase of droughts, weather changes, and environment change, they both feel the pressure to cut emissions and help out their communities. Plus, it's the most feasible option to invest, rather than face those disasters. Not saying that taking action after Paris is easy. There are skeptics on the necessity of fighting climate change, such as those from the Cato Institute, Heritage Foundation, like Joe mentioned, and the Americans for Prosperity. But what do these skeptics of climate change have in common? They were all funded by the Koch brothers, whose industries are responsible for emitting 24 million tons of carbon dioxide a year, with the intention of preventing to cut their emissions. Not to cut their emissions. Due to companies' insistence, the world is being held responsible for their consequences. Although the most devastating effects are in the long run, we should care. We should care that many of our lives are at potential risk, maybe even eventually your future family. Our people, our environment, our Earth, could be facing extremely drastic conditions that could halt the existence of life as we know it to be. The question we need to ask ourselves is whether or not the Paris Agreement is too little too late, The question we need to ask now is, if not now, then when? Thank you.
Should politics and science collide in addressing an existential threat to global civilization? This is the question that comes to mind when thinking about the Paris Agreement. And to be clear, it is not the argument on whether or not climate change exists, but it is recognizing that only after a marathon of hard negotiating, all nations finally agreed to reduce greenhouse gases. Is the Paris Agreement a huge milestone in the battle against climate change, or is it too little, too late? The Paris Agreement set long-term goals of keeping the increase in global average temperatures to well below 2 degrees Celsius, and aims to limit the increase of those temperatures to 1.5 degrees Celsius. However, according to climate scientist James Rand, the agreement only comes into force in 2020, a time frame by which huge amounts of additional carbon dioxide will have already been pumped into the air, making it impossible to reach the targets set forth in the Paris Agreement. Even if the science was correct, there is no statement in the agreement that gives any clue to how this might be achieved besides voluntary contributions. Climate scientist John Christie stated that even if climate models were correct, a 50% reduction in carbon dioxide emissions by 2050 would avert only 7% of warming by the year 2100. This suggests that even if all countries kept their pledges, only a minute percentage of emissions would be reduced globally in the allotted time frame given by the Paris Agreement. Miles Allen, the head of the Climate Dynamics Group at Oxford University, stated that achieving a balance between sources and sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of this century will require net carbon dioxide emissions to be reduced to 0. However, as long as fossil fuels appear to be the cheapest fuels out there, they will continue to be burned, making it a challenge for countries to simply cut their usage. So far, 60% of countries have made a formal emissions pledges that covers more than 75% of current global emissions. And while cutting carbon emissions could be a simple solution, the Paris Agreement does not take into account population growth and other issues that contribute to climate change. Even if emissions stopped growing today, global warming would still continue. We add greenhouse gases into the atmosphere far faster than they can be removed. And if it was possible to stop gas emissions, it would still not balance the flows. The planet will continue to warm, and we will continue to come closer to dangerous tipping points that will cause rapid, permanent warming and sea level rise. The Paris Agreement is a nice idea. It appeals to our lofty aspirations and our goals to address a major issue as a national society. However, there is a difference between our aspirations and the reality. And the reality shows that it is already too late to attack this issue within the framework given by the Paris Agreement. Climate scientist James Hansen stated that temperatures have already risen greatly and are on track to blow past the 2-degree mark, even if every country contributed what they offered in the Paris Agreement. According to NASA, global temperatures have climbed 1.4 degrees Fahrenheit since 1880. And while 1.4 degrees sounds trivial, it has caused our sea levels to rise by 12 inches. National Geographic estimates that sea levels will rise another 6.5 feet by the year 2100. The United Nations Development Program addresses issues of disaster risk reduction, including efforts to build flood banks and use renewable energy in developing countries in order to protect themselves from rising sea levels. About 2.6 of the world's population live in areas that will be vulnerable to chronic flooding within the next 100 years. At minimum, even with extremely rigorous global emission cuts, 1.9% of the population of coastal countries would be affected. The fall of the Paris Agreement is undeniable. Therefore, instead of giving money to a failed cause, the funds could be best used to serve our planet by protecting those most vulnerable by contributing to disaster protection causes. The agreement is gaining over $120 billion in donations from countries. Consequently, we should ask ourselves, is it morally right to divert funds in an effort to stop a process that will ultimately happen, when we can use those investments towards preparation methods? As Americans, we have a proven track record of coming to support those in need during times of difficulty, which is why it would be most logical to contribute the funds from the Paris Agreement to help combat symptoms of climate change. In conclusion, while the Paris Agreement is good in theory, in practice, it's highly unlikely that it's going to work. And while some critics may argue that doing something is better than nothing, participating in a politics of hope only makes for good PR campaigns and PowerPoints. Politics of reason will always prevail. Thank you.
Oh man, okay. On that note, so before you guys sat down, there were 2 ballots on your seats. Hold on to one of them. For one, we have 2 teams, the A and the B side. You're gonna basically check off which side you think presented their argument better. We'll give you guys about a good 2 or 3 minutes for that, and then we'll collect the ballots and move on to the next section tonight.
Yeah, I'm a
Just look at this.
I know their side. That was the group I was a part of. I know if they're on the group.
Coming around over here, Alex, you got
You better kill it. Wait a second, you're not supposed to be voting.
No. I can't sit here? Besides, what if I vote opposite my team, Kale? This shirt up my
All right. Did anyone not turn in a ballot? Okay, cool, awesome. Okay, so we're gonna move on to the next section of tonight's debate. So, the next section of tonight will be covering Citizens United. Citizens United is essentially an organization that is dedicated to restoring government back into the hands of the citizens. So, we're going to be focusing on 2 sides again. To get a little bit of background for Citizens United. Citizens United basically advocates for traditional American values, which they feel are not present in contemporary America. So some of these values include free enterprise and limited government. As noble as these virtues are for Citizens United, they have been accused of entrenching upon democracy by profiting and simultaneously undermining our very own government. So the true question is whether or not Citizens United is a true patriot, or does it only wish to disembowel what they claim to fight for? Now, on the side for Citizens United, we have Tim and Chelsea, and on the side against Citizens United, we have Abraham and Berkeley. So we're going to be doing the same thing as last time. Tim's going to be speaking first, and then we're going to go to Abraham, and then we're going to go back over to Chelsea, and then Berkeley's going to finish us off for tonight. All right, so I'm going to hand the floor over to Tim.
Hello everyone, I want to thank you for coming. I want to clarify something. Before Citizens, a lot of the things you could do before Citizens United, they just merely clarified these things and made it actually legal. So I want to start with something. Ever since this ruling, it's become one distorted headline after another. How billionaires run politics and how the 1% control 100% of America. What I'm going to attempt to demonstrate to all of you is how much the media has rolled review of this ruling. They have attempted to create a monster out of a mouse. For instance, a common trope that the media plays up is that big money buys US elections. It's a simple assumption to make, which plays off trigger words like corruption, bribery, and dirty money. However, there is a lack of evidence to support this claim. And evidence that scholars normally cite is dubious at best. Justice Kennedy noted in his opinion on the ruling that no evidence was marshaled in the 100,000 pages of legal briefs to show that unrestricted campaign money ever bought a lawmaker's vote. Imagine now if we were all part of the 1%. We have all the money we want, and we want to keep it. So we invest, and we invest in politics. For instance, since March of 2010, $418 billion have been spent on negative ads against Obamacare, which is laughable compared to the 27 spent promoting Obamacare. $418 billion, that's a lot of money. Imagine what you can do with that. And while public opinion on Obamacare is extremely divided, it appears public opinion has not been changed by this large sum of money. According to a Gallup poll, views on Obamacare have not significantly changed since its introduction. Let's consider this. If the rich could buy politics, we would expect them to pay less in taxes. On the contrary, the top 1% have had to pay more in federal income taxes since the ruling, paying 5.7% more in the past 2 years alone. Yes, we can agree that money is a necessity for running a campaign, but it is not absolute. Look at this current campaign trail. Jeb Bush had received the most Republican contributions, 159 million to be exact, but had to drop out of the running because money is not the end-all means to winning elections. A report from the Journal of Political Economy says that doubling current campaign spending only changes the results of voter outcome by 1%. Going along with imagining yourself as a 1%er, let's say you're part of the coal, oil, and gas industry, one of the perceived sources of dirty money. These industries have spent $2 billion lobbying Congress since 1999. $2 billion. And according to the Bureau of Safety and Environmental Enforcement, new regulations could cost oil companies $25 billion over the next decade. $2 billion to $25 billion. If you were a 1%er that invested this $2 billion, it certainly didn't pay off. Let's go back to how the media has skewed our perspective of this ruling. You might ask, what motive would they have for fabricating this controversial story? It's simple. Since the media is a profit-driven entity, it has an incentive to sensationalize stories. And one of its biggest sellers, rich versus poor, which is what we're seeing with this ruling. Pre-Citizens United, if politicians wanted their voice heard on an issue, they would have to approach a media outlet and have them air it. However, this message would be what the media wanted and not what the politician wanted. Now with social media and Citizens United, candidates can bypass the media and approach people like us for funding. For instance, Bernie Sanders relied on social media to fund his campaign. We frankly wouldn't have a Bernie Sanders or Ted Cruz, whether you like these candidates or hate them. But isn't it a good thing that there are more voices in this election than in previous that have all contained establishment candidates? Citizens United has opened up the ability for candidates to be chosen and funded by people rather than parties choosing behind closed doors. The question I pose is how can removing the ability for political parties to control who runs be a bad thing? The Citizens United ruling has, if anything, improved our freedom of speech and weakened the parties in this country. People think that allowing groups such as labor unions to indirectly fund candidates has led to a monopoly on our political system, when in fact, it has allowed more voices to be heard. Those who criticize this ruling have lost sight of a basic truth. If you disagree with someone, you don't try to restrict their speech, but you answer it with more speech. This goes with our First Amendment right. We should be allowed to support people and issues we believe in, and that means funding these issues and people we believe in. This decision will ensure, just as Justice Kennedy said 20 years ago, that there is no stifling of the voices of some of the most respected groups in public life on subjects central to the integrity of our democratic system. If you're going to take anything away from my speech, just understand that the media is fronting false information. They're not telling the entire story. The ruling has its benefits to everybody, and not just the wealthy elite. Thank you.
Before we begin, I would like to thank our opponents for coming up here and talking about social media and our rights to freedom. We will clearly address this between my speech and my partner's speech. And of course, I'd like to thank the audience. Now, tonight's topic is centered around the controversial 5-4 U.S. Supreme Court decision on the Citizens United versus the Federal Election Commission case and its effect on our democracy. But before we get into specifics, let's take a look at a situation that took place right under our nose. In Richmond, California, 4 years ago, a massive fire at Chevron's oil refinery sent 15,000 residents to the hospital. The mayor and citizens of Richmond realized that Chevron was prioritizing company profits and executive pay over public safety. What most of them did not expect, however, was for the company to flood more than $3 million to a campaign in 2014 to oust those government officials looking to hold the company responsible for their gross mismanagement in Richmond, California. In short, Chevron spent more than $3 million to back a slate of pro-Chevron candidates for mayor and city council in the city of Richmond in the 2014 election. The Los Angeles Times reported that Chevron paid for TV attack ads, purchased space on virtually every billboard on town, funded a flood of mailers, and even went on to finance a fake news website run by a Chevron employee. In Richmond, California, the Citizens United versus the Federal Elections decision bought the city's election. In 2017, Chevron will install its 4th oil refinery in the city. A project that faced absolutely no opposition with the newly elected government. So let me ask, do you think the ability of a corporation to essentially buy votes strengthens or undermines our democracy and the legitimacy of that government? The ruling on the infamous Citizens United case has allowed for the expansion of unregulated political action committees, otherwise known as super PACs, which are committees allowed to collect money from labor unions, corporations, and billionaires to support a certain politician or political ideology. Meanwhile, voters like us can only provide a one-time per election donation of $2,700 to a political candidate. It's important for the audience to remember, tonight's topic is ultimately about whether Citizens United makes our political system better or if it makes it worse. There has always been money, corruption, and disinformation in politics. The question is whether there has been more or less of that post-Citizens United. According to a survey conducted by Bloomberg Politics, 78% of Americans believe Citizens United should be overturned because It is drowning out the voices of ordinary Americans and distorting our democracy. The Citizens United ruling undermines the legitimacy of our national government as well. Through his own super PAC, billionaire Thomas Steyer contributed $13 million in this presidential election alone. That's more than enough money to pay for the total tuition of every student in this classroom. But he doesn't only have influence at the national level. Although the media refuses to publicize this, he contributed $85 million in 2014 to congressional and senatorial races. He did so because Kinder Morgan, a company in which he's a major stakeholder, needed congressional support to acquire the Keystone Pipeline contract. As a result, the researchers from the Center of Response for Politics found that Thomas Steyer funded enough congressional elections in 2014 to purchase the votes of those congressional leaders up for re-election. Now, the opposition may come up here again and argue that there is absolutely no evidence as to how Citizens United has actually undermined our democracy. But as Richmond, California, and the $85 million that went into buying the Keystone Pipeline contract beg to differ. As we've seen, Citizens United has created a direct forum in which government officials must bow down to the interests of the corporations and the rich. The ability of a single wealthy entity to inject millions of dollars into the political system significantly affects the perceived legitimacy of that system and shows the world that in America, people's political voices are proportional to their pocketbooks. The more the election system can be used as a tool to unduly influence politicians, the less legitimacy it possesses. It is time we let every power-hungry billionaire know that they cannot buy our government. Regardless of political affiliation, ideology, or interest, whether it's the City Hall of Richmond, California, or the halls of Congress, no one should be able to buy America's democracy. Thank you.
So, I'd like to begin by reminding the audience that my partner Tim explained that there is a lack of evidence supporting the common argument that money in politics equals power. We don't believe in corporations buying votes. We believe in people getting their voices heard. Abe made a seemingly good point about corporations and Chevron, and although the situation is plausible, it's easy to pick opposing evidence supporting this claim. It's also important to keep in mind that the Citizens United ruling does not legalize massive donations to candidates. Rather, it gives organizations a chance to support candidates that have similar sentiments on meaningful issues. The Citizens United ruling reinforces the right we have to free speech, the right to freely associate, and a free democracy. A stance against the Citizens United ruling is a stance against American political values. Now, I'd like to introduce a new perspective, that the Citizens United ruling is actually beneficial to all. What does Autism Speaks, Americans for Prosperity, and Women's Self-Worth all have in common? These are all nonprofits that did not have the ability to have their voices heard in a pre-Citizens United world. First, I'd like to speak about Autism Speaks. It's an autism advocacy organization in the United States that sponsors autism research and conducts awareness and outreach activities aimed at families, governments, and the public. Autism Speaks has raised awareness for autism research, raised funds directly for research, and lobbied Congress to leverage the privately raised money with much greater public funds. From 1997 to 2006, their advocacy in the areas of treatment and environmental factors shifted research priorities in the U.S. from basic research to translational and clinical research, with less emphasis on the underlying biology and greater emphasis on putting what was known to practical use. As for Americans' Prosperity, it is a nonprofit political advocacy group of grassroots leaders who engage citizens in the name of limited government and free market on the local, state, and federal levels. AFP consists of more than 1.2 million members in all 50 states whose mission is to mobilize citizens to advocate for policies that cut red tape and increase opportunity, putting the brakes on government overspending and getting the economy working for hard workers, not special interests. AFP works to build coalitions of like-minded organizations fighting for the common cause of lower taxation and free market principles. As citizen activists, they organize events, write letters to editors, and petition their lawmakers to uphold freedom and prosperity. AFP also has a separate entity called the Americans for Prosperity Foundation that is committed to educating citizens about economic policy and a return of the federal government to its constitutional limits. Lastly, I'd like to talk about the Self-Worth Foundation. The Cheryl Savin Self-Worth Foundation for Women and Girls believes that gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls is fundamental to changing society for the better of all humankind. This nonprofit strives to empower women through leadership, STEM programs, scholarships, healthcare, family planning, and much more. They also use their donations towards supporting candidates with similar opinions. As one of Hillary Clinton's top donors, the Self-Worth Foundation uses their donations to generate advocacy for women in politics. It's exciting to think that we are at the point in history where we might possibly have the first female president. It is most certainly the case that Hillary Clinton has benefited from the Citizens United ruling by being supported through organizations that also support her beliefs. It's clear that money also supports a progressive agenda. The Citizens United ruling has allowed nonprofits such as Autism Speaks, Americans for Prosperity, Women's Self-Worth, and many more to have a voice. By creating opportunities for people to support politicians, it's clear that the Citizens United ruling is consistent with First Amendment values. The U.S. Constitution cannot ensure equal speech, but it does allow for freedom of speech. To end, I'd like to quote James Madison. The instability, injustice, and confusion introduced into the public councils have in truth been the mortal diseases under which popular governments have everywhere perished. As they continue to be the favorite and fruitful topics for which the adversaries to liberty derive their most specious declamations. The valuable improvements made by the American constitutions on the popular models, both ancient and modern, cannot certainly be too much to be admired, but it would be an unwarrantable partiality to contend that they have as effectually obviated the danger on this side as was wished and expected. James Madison was always one to value freedom of thought and freedom of opinion. In the aftermath, the Citizens United ruling has created a place where the extremely wealthy does not overcrowd the voice of others. In fact, other voices that were excluded because of the prior system have now the capacity to be heard. Even when creating the Constitution, the framers were aware that in a free society, it was impossible to escape interest groups. There were so many competing interests, many fear that one will voice out the other. So how do we ensure a healthy republic? The answer is more interest groups, more association. By increasing the number of organizations, we create a healthier democracy. Thank you.
Thank you guys all for coming out tonight. I know that it's been a long process. I promise I'll make it quick. It's almost over. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the points that my partner has made about Citizens United that allowed Chevron to buy an entire town in our state, allowed the rich to buy the lives of the poor, and the decisions of our Congress. Next, I'd like to discuss something that we all know and that has been perpetuated by Citizens United. Lack of transparency supported by negative ads campaigns, as Tim mentioned before. If you feel like you've seen an exceptional number of these ads lately, think black and white images, booming statistics, and terrifying voices, you're not alone. In fact, this year's presidential campaign has been the most negative thus far, with over 70% negative ads. And I'm sure most of you are asking yourselves, why should I care? But the horrifying reality is that these negative campaigns are disastrously fueling corruption, increasing hate speech, misinforming the public, and lowering voter turnout, which are all against our Constitution and contributing to undermining the democracy within our system. Citizens United has created a great imbalance in today's society, as the richest voices are viewed as the most important in today's super PAC era. And, as we know, these campaign Citizens United funds are often rooted in misinformation and extreme distortion. Negative campaigns often target candidates with wildly inaccurate and culturally unacceptable attacks, forcing candidates to spend time defending themselves and spend less time on pertinent issues in an election. Citizens United has thus directly opened the floodgates of funding for groups based in misinformation. But an effective election process is dependent on an informed and knowledgeable public. Do you think it's fair that Citizens United is undermining the legitimacy of the United States' fair electoral system that we were founded upon? And shockingly, it's not the candidates themselves who are suddenly turning vicious. The largest change is outside groups' campaigns, And as stated by the Wesleyan Media Project, the #1 reason this campaign season has been so negative is the skyrocketing involvement of interest groups, and who have increased their activity by over 1,100% in the last 4 years, coinciding, surprisingly enough, with the rise of Citizens United. With the Supreme Court's decision in favor of Citizens United, outside groups can spend an unlimited amount of money on campaigns as long as they do not coordinate with said candidate. The decision in favor of Citizens United has also led to the advent of super PACs, groups whose sole purpose is to spend money attacking their opponents and lauding the candidates that they support. And the results of the super PAC era are clear. And as stated in a study by Harvard Law, in 2008 only 25% of outside group ads were negative, but today 86% of outside groups ads are. This is a direct infringement on our democracy. Because these slanderous ads and their funding cannot be traced through these super PACs in the Citizens United world, candidates can shy away from taking any responsibility for these ads. And Citizens United thus creates a forum and an increase of hate, bias, and racism, as we've seen especially in today's most recent political election. This also silences the voices of many, as 41% of the total money by outside groups of this year came from just 50 donors and their relatives, as according to Washington Post analysis. 36 of those are wealthy supporters who have invested millions in trying to shape the GOP primary election, which accounts for more than 70% of the money from the top 50. Do you think that 50 donors should be more important than 245 million voters, including all of us in this room? Finally, these negative campaigns are lowering voter turnout and lessening the validity of our electoral system. As stated in Stanford University's 2014 study, negative presidential campaigns have lowered presidential voter turnout by 10% and local voter turnout by more than double that. But why should we care about Citizens United effects on our political system? Well, allowing large corporations to flow without restriction into campaign movements can only undermine the confidence that we as an American people have in our government, contributing only to the imbalance in the system in favor of the 1% and at the expense of us as hardworking Americans. As a result of Citizens United, we have seen various negative campaigns time and time again produce ads that were allowed to both circulate and have negative consequences. These ads include the Think and Spank ad of South Carolina, funded by the enormously wealthy and right-wing super PAC American for Prosperity, as mentioned by Chelsea, courtesy of Citizens United. Campaigns blaming a married woman for the infidelic actions of her husband, funded by the Tito super PAC, courtesy of Citizens United. The bigoted We Need More Nukes campaign, funded by the infamous JRH and BR super PAC, courtesy of, you guessed it, Citizens United. These and 44,000 other advertisements this year, funded by those such as Charles and David Koch with their subsidiary organizations, have one thing in common: bought by insert special interests, courtesy of Citizens United. As a whole, the points that my partner and I have both made contribute to today's overall underlying theme. Citizens United serves as a scapegoat for the rich and both enforces the ideals of the 1%, and as a whole undermines the democracy that we as an American people were founded upon. Therefore, everyone today, remember that when you cast your decision tonight, your vote can't be bought.
This is really exciting. Okay, so you guys now have a second ballot. You're going to be filling out which team you thought did better, Team A or Team B. We'll be giving you guys a couple minutes for that, and we'll bring back the results.